We're happy to put this panel together on Palestinian National Strategy. I think it is a very important topic to address, particularly at this time. Approximately 1 year ago, we began to hear about the pursuance of an alternative strategy on behalf of the PLO and the formal leadership. And we began to see that unfold and continue to unfold most recently, in fact, this week with the application to UNESCO and, of course, the international reaction and the reaction from Washington, D.C. So it is a particularly important moment to ask, what is Palestinian National Strategy? What has it been? What can it be? And what is the best method in which to address the Palestinian question? So we are very happy to have, and this is the order in which they will be presenting, Dr. Mustafa Barghouti, who is the Secretary General of Al Mubadara and President of the Union of Palestinian Medical Relief Committees, an NGO that provides health and community services to more than 1 million people annually in the occupied territories. Dr. Barghouti, I hope you can hear us, and we're very happy that you can join us via Skype from Europe. Dr. Salim Tamari is going to be speaking then. He's a professor of sociology at Birzeit University and also a senior fellow at the Institute for Palestine Studies and director of the IPS-affiliated Institute for Jerusalem Studies. And last but not least, of course, Ms. Riham Barghouti. You could see there's a trend on this panel here, is a founding member of the Palestinian Campaign for Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, which is part of the BDS National Committee in Palestine. She's also a founding member of Adala New York, the New York campaign for the boycott of Israel. So please join me in welcoming our panel today. And we'll turn it over at this point for introductory comments from Dr. Barghouti, joining us on Skype.
All right. I thank you so much for inviting me to participate today, and I hope this goes well with this technology. And I'm sorry I can't be with you, but there was a conflict in dates, so the topic you are addressing today is very important, and I think we are standing at a very important crossroad in Palestine when it comes to the issue of strategy. As a matter of fact, I think life has shown that the previous strategy that was followed for a while did not work. And in particular, I would say that for a long while, there were two alternatives conflicting with each other. One alternative was that we can achieve our rights only through negotiations and negotiations only. And I think after 20 years of failure of these negotiations, we've reached a drastic end where any more negotiations will lead practically to nothing. And second line was that only through military actions we can achieve a change in the situation. Again, this approach also has reached its limitation. And today we are witnessing a situation where new ideas are coming up. In my opinion, today, the most important basic fact is that after 20 years of Madrid Conference and more than 18 years of Oslo Agreement, or 17 years of Oslo Agreement, we've reached the deadlock of the so-called peace process. It has become clear now that the peace process is nothing but a cover for Israeli expansionist policy, for this Israeli settlement building, and for the Israeli project, which is trying to impose Bantustans and cantons and ghettos as a substitute to Palestinian statehood. And what we witness today is nothing but a situation where any more negotiations will simply be used by Israel to justify its policies, and any more abstention from recognizing the reality on the ground will be simply criminal to the Palestinian cause. And after 20 years, we have to see the reality, and the reality is that no negotiations anywhere in the world would produce results as long as the balance of power is not in your favor. Any student in any political science department understands that. And the problem has been that there were hopes from negotiations, and many people built all their hopes on negotiations and thought that if we, the Palestinians, behave well, if we abstain from any military actions, if we abstain even from any form of resistance, the United States will like us and will force Israel to stop the occupation, and we will get our state. That whole paradigm has failed and came to its end. And that's why I think a Palestinian new strategy must concentrate on one particular factor, which is how to change the balance of power. Without changing the balance of power, we can achieve nothing. And in that respect, I personally believe that a Palestinian new strategy should be based on 4 pillars of struggle. The first is wide, popular, nonviolent resistance, as wide as possible. Not because people who are under occupation are not entitled to military resistance. No, the international law provides for that, as long as these acts respect international law and international humanitarian law. But because nonviolent popular resistance has proven to be, in our particular situation, the most effective, the one that can produce results, and a form of struggle that everybody can participate in. As a matter of fact, even those who concentrated mainly on military action have come to the conclusion today that through the agreements of ceasefire that they have concluded, that popular nonviolent resistance is probably the most important and the most effective. But that is only one pillar of our strategy, and I see today a widening of this popular resistance, not only in the form of the demonstrations that take place against the apartheid rule and against occupation and against the isolation of Jerusalem, but also in this unprecedented rise today of boycott of Israeli products. We've just started a huge campaign last Sunday, which will target Israeli products one after the other, aiming at making Israel lose economically, since Israel is selling products worth of $3.5 billion every year in the occupied territory. And by cutting off this sale, by creating a strong and effective boycott campaign, I think we can enhance a serious harm to their economic ability. In other words, through boycott campaign, in addition to other forms of popular nonviolent resistance, we can make the occupation costly. We can make occupation lose. And only then the policy in Israel could change. But that's only one form of, one pillar of what I call a new strategy. The second pillar that should be achieved as soon as possible is unity between Palestinians. There hasn't been any case in human history, I guess, where a national liberation movement has without having a unified leadership. And one of the biggest problems we face today is the fact that we are still divided, regardless of the fact that objectively we don't have to be divided. Objectively, there isn't much to differ about, especially after the failure of the negotiations approach. So one very important part of the new strategy, in my opinion, should be the establishment of a unified strategy. That is not difficult. That is not impossible. It is achievable, and the most recent reconciliation agreement that was signed in Cairo provides for a good basis for that. If there is a real will to achieve unity, and if there is readiness to steadfast against the external pressures, especially those coming from Israel and the United States, against the conclusion of Palestinian unity. The third very important component, in my opinion, to make our struggle succeed is a mobilization of a powerful international solidarity campaign with the Palestinian people, concentrating on boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israeli occupation, against Israeli policy. Is this achievable? The answer is yes. In other words, we can repeat, and we should repeat, the model of South African struggle against apartheid. As a matter of fact, we are struggling against the worst form of apartheid in human history. An apartheid that is described frequently by our South African friends as a much worse apartheid than the one they knew in South Africa. So a strong campaign of boycott, divestment, sanctions is a third component that is needed, in my opinion, in this strategy, because without changing the balance internationally, we cannot force Israel to move. And I can tell that most recently there has been a lot of successes in this regard. In the United States, to my knowledge, there has been a good campaign against Ahava magazines in the United States. There was another one that was closed down in London. But the biggest maybe success was the prevention of a huge deal that Alstom company, which is a French company that was responsible for the creation of a train railway inside East Jerusalem, violating international law by creating a project inside occupied territory. That company, Alstom company, has just lost a big deal in the Saudi Arabia thanks to the boycott campaign, and they've lost approximately $9 billion worth of a huge economic project that was they were supposed to take in Saudi Arabia. So the BDS campaign can be also a very effective method in combination, of course, with popular nonviolent resistance. The fourth element, which is an internal element for us Palestinians inside the occupied territories, I believe, is a change of economic policy by the Palestinian Authority. A change in the direction of strengthening the ability of steadfastness of those who are subjected to Israeli violations, those who are subjected to settlement activities, the apartheid wall. Today, the policy that is conducted is concentrating on enhancement of consumption beyond people's ability, and it does not give sufficient attention to the areas that are affected or threatened by the Israeli occupation. And what we need is a new, different policy, especially now in the light of the most recent actions of Israel to punish Palestinians for their call in the United Nations. An example of popular nonviolent resistance is what we witnessed at this very moment with the two ships trying to approach Gaza and break the blockade in Gaza Strip. These are heroic actions, fantastic solidarity actions, and they do bring huge attention to the Palestinian cause and the need for solidarity with Palestinians. Another sample or example of the popular nonviolent resistance is what I call diplomatic resistance. And in that sense, going to the United Nations and demanding full membership there was a right act in the right direction, in my opinion. And the fact that they are going to deny us this membership because the United States will use the veto or pressure countries not to vote with us has already led to the creation of a fantastic approach where we are going to every UN agency, one after the other. First UNESCO, but I hope we will proceed to go to the other 16 agencies of the United Nations and getting full membership there. These are all acts that can change the balance of power. These are all acts that can change the paradigm and deprive Israel from the situation where they are dictating on us or trying to dictate on us their own solution. In my opinion, today, we cannot wait anymore. And the last thing that should happen is resumption of these useless negotiations, because if that happens, there will be nothing but a cover to Israeli expansionist policy. One very last point I would like to mention, just to clarify matters. I cannot guarantee that we can have two-state solution. If the Israeli policy continues and if we don't manage to change the balance of power early enough, and if the international community fails to pressure Israel as it should, it is quite possible that the whole possibility of two-state solution could vanish. But then, that should not bring us to despair. Instead of accepting to be slaves of occupation and apartheid Israeli system, I think then we would have to say enough is enough. And if two-state solution is not going to be viable, and if we are not going to have a fully sovereign Palestinian true state with Jerusalem as its capital, without violating the rights of the Palestinian refugees, then might as well we should try to struggle for full democratic rights for everybody in one state solution. I am very optimistic. Today I tell you, after, during the last week, during the campaign, we started to boycott Israeli products. I, for the first time maybe in many years, a amount of enthusiasm in the streets of Palestine. People are searching for ways to resist occupation. People want to be proactive. People are sick and tired of waiting for others to do things for us. People are sick and tired of being just reactive to what others are doing for us. I think there is great enthusiasm to a new line, to a new strategy, to a new mobilization of the Palestinian people. But let me tell you, one very important factor that has been lost all 20 years was the Palestinian, the fact that the Palestinian diaspora and the Palestinians who live abroad have been marginalized from the Palestinian struggle. Oslo Agreement was responsible for that. Oslo Agreement marginalized Palestinians abroad and made them feel that they were not part of the struggle. We have to reverse that. And we have to find a way, through the mobilization of Palestinians everywhere, in the United States, in Europe, in the other Arab countries. We have to mobilize them now to participate in the Palestinian struggle. If they can't participate in the popular nonviolent resistance, they should participate in the boycott campaign. They should participate in the creation of a strong boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign against Israel wherever they live. And in the Arab countries now, they have tremendous possibilities, because with the changes in the Arab world, with the Arab revolutions that have taken place, we have now a great potential and great opportunity for much greater solidarity with the Palestinian people. These are my remarks. I believe completely in a new strategy, and I believe that we should depart from the old line and gather our forces now in a unified form, in a unified manner, and look forward to the future, which can only be promising to the Palestinian people. Thank you.
I'm greatly honored to be sharing this panel with my colleagues, the great Dr. Mustafa Barghouti, who's leading a very important independent struggle in Palestine against occupation and for a more genuine representation of the Palestinian people, and my colleague, former colleague in Birzeit University, Riham Barghouti, who is also leading a very significant struggle here in the United States on the question of boycott. It's very hard not to crack a joke about being squeezed by two Barghoutis. But I would let this go. A frequent question following the Arab Spring rebellions of early this year is why the Palestinians were left out. Why did they not join their Tunisian, Egyptian, Yemeni compatriots and other Arab youth in seeking regime change? Why was there no reenactment of the first Intifada of 1987 or the second Intifada of 2000? The short answer is that there was indeed a rebellion of a kind that went relatively unnoticed. Palestinian youth throughout the spring of 2011 have moved collectively in two directions. They occupied public squares in Nablus, Ramallah, Hebron, Jenin, and Gaza, demanding an end to the split between Gaza and the West Bank, between Fatah and Hamas, and demanding reconciliation of the two parts of the national movement. They also moved in successive waves to confront settlers and soldiers in key areas throughout the cities of the West Bank and in the heart of Jerusalem. But the major question remains unanswered, since these protest groups do not amount to a mass movement and have in fact occurred within a relative quietism, if not complacency, among the majority of Palestinians. Nor did they put forth any demand to bring down the government, isqat al-nizam, or even a regime change. Why? Because, in my view, most Palestinians realize that both Haniyeh and Abbas, Hamas and Fatah, are themselves hostages of the Israeli regime of occupation, which they see as their main protagonist and tormentor. There was, in fact, several proposals voiced in the local press, some of them coming from within the ranks of the Fatah Revolutionary Council meeting last week in the occupied territories, for the dissolution of the PNA and the transfer of power to the Israelis, thus unmasking the colonial nature of Israeli control and the emasculated capacities of the Palestinian Authority to govern. What undermined this proposal were two factors: fear that some warlord, maybe Ala Dahlan, would step forward and fill in the vacuum on behalf of the Israelis, leading to a Somalization of the Palestinian territories. And second, that Hamas saw the proposal as an invitation for them to transfer power. At the heart of this dilemma lies a major consequence of the Oslo Accords, which was the redeployment of the Israeli military government and the Israeli army from inside the urban centers of Palestine to peripheral nodes of control in a formidable network of bypass roads, checkpoints, and the wall of separation. Thus, unlike the situation of the first Intifada, where civil disobedience was successfully directed at the occupation regime and its infrastructure, the new system of control, ushered since 1994, is insular, hidden, and is circumvented by a continued regime of indirect occupation masked by the security apparatus of the Palestine National Authority. The hands of Israel are now felt but not seen, as Moshe Dayan was very fond of saying in the 1970s. Having realized these constraints and limitations, Palestinians living in the occupied territories also realized that a frontal confrontation with the army and the settlers would lead to massive losses without achieving tangible results, leading thus to a situation of depleting their resources. That is why the demands for regime change in Palestine is paralyzed by the absence of a meaningful alternative. And that is why many people outside the authority and within it came to expect deliverance to come from external factors. But the external elements that the PLO and the PA, and in a different setting, Hamas government in Gaza, had depended on have themselves proven to be problematic. Both the Quartet and the US have demonstrated time and again that they are unwilling and or unable to break the deadlock by insisting on continued negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis as a key platform for achieving independence and an end to occupation. A conditional precondition that now has acquired a hollow echo, given the Israeli prolonged negotiations as a cover, which originally was developed by Ishaq Shamir after the Madrid Peace Conference, to postpone any commitment on territorial issues. An astonishing and little-noticed news item appeared in mid-October, a fortnight ago, just before the UNESCO vote, in which the US warned Israel against the continuation of building a new settlement extension near Gilo, south of Jerusalem. Such a move, the American ambassador asserted, quote, would harm U.S. efforts to thwart the Palestinian bid for statehood at the United Nations. I repeat, it would harm U.S. efforts to thwart the Palestinian bid for statehood at the United Nations. This was enunciated in a meeting last Wednesday between U.S. envoy to Israel, Dan Shapiro, and Interior Minister Eli Yishai. Note that the message of the U.S. administration is communicated between the U.S. ambassador and the Israeli Minister of Interior. not between the American envoy and the Prime Minister or the Foreign Minister, as is normal in such state relations. Notwithstanding the American intervention, the Jerusalem District Planning Committee, according to Haaretz, announced late last month that it would approve the construction of 1,100 new housing units in Gilo, despite past U.S. objections concerning any work that would expand the neighborhood further beyond the Green Line. The purpose of these expansions is to seal the last remaining gap which connects Greater Jerusalem to the West Bank. What is striking about the statement is not U.S. objection to the construction, but the rationale it brought against it, namely that it would undermine U.S. efforts to thwart the bid for statehood at the United Nations Security Council. Thus, under the Obama administration, the U.S. has culminated a progressive shift in the Middle Eastern policy from one of mediating the Arab-Israeli conflict, originally held in the Madrid Peace Conference, beginning with a call for return to 1967 borders, to calling settlement activity as being contrary to a peaceful resolution of the conflict, to settlements being unhelpful, and now, today, to settlement expansion as undermining the strategy to stop the Palestinian bid for statehood, in favor, presumably, of direct negotiations between the two parties. On the Israeli side, the objective of these moves has been rather consistent, namely to create irreversible facts on the ground through redrawing boundaries, zoning laws, categories of residency, and the physical movement of population, and the creation of permanent settlements that will make any return to the 1967 boundaries physically impossible and politically unrealizable. This is a strategy of preemption that has been eminently successful and was able to impose a fait accompli on the Palestinians with faint verbal protestations from the Europeans. What is worse is that it succeeded in producing a magical connivance from the Clinton administration and all successive U.S. administrations since, that it is no longer practical to go back to the June 1967 boundaries. It was this belated realization that the American position is a de facto endorsement, albeit a negative one, of Israeli preemptive strategies that drove the Palestinian leadership to seek international redress at the UN in its bid for statehood admission. And even though the chance of success this November of this bid in 2 or 3 weeks are very slim, either because of Palestine's inability to muster the essential 9-nation support. At the moment, the problem is with Bosnia, it seems, or because of the inevitable American veto if such support is garnered. It is also supplemented by the realization that European relative autonomy from American policy is not leading anywhere. The reasons are the inability of the EU to conduct a united foreign policy and the subordination of the Quartet and its titular mediator Tony Blair to US diktat vis-à-vis Israeli moves. Against these conditions, we witness a new regional conditions that accompanied the Arab rebellions of the spring. We have a new energized but yet not stabilized Egyptian regime that is bound to lift the embargo against Gaza and bring to an end the isolation of the Hamas government. This is offset by the decline of Syria as a logistic asset and patron of the Hamas leadership in Damascus. We also have the emergence of Turkey as a new regional economic power and political arbiter, drawing on its Ottoman heritage and openly calling for a new Middle East that would not tolerate Israel's continued intransigence. Despite the Mavi Marmara incident, we should not discount Turkey's ability to continue as a mediating force in future negotiations. And thirdly, we have the emergence of a significant difference within the European community in the role of the Quartet, most recently expressed by the voting pattern in which France, Spain, and several other important European countries voted in favor. Add to this the UNESCO vote this week, which has brought in the UN as a significant arena in the struggle for Palestine. one which can play a crucial factor in mobilizing regional, European, and international actors, some of whom with critical clout on Israel, for intervention and for creating an alternative to the hegemonic role of the UN and the paralyzed role of the Quartet. What then is an alternative strategy in the face of these overwhelming odds? I know this was the subject of my talk, but I had to have this long introduction. It is clear that Palestinians cannot produce miracles, that the objective situation in the world today is lopsided against Palestinian aspirations, and that there are built-in structural factors that mitigate against bringing in an early Israeli withdrawal. And even though we are witnessing a crisis of leadership in Palestine, it is important to realize that the weakness of the leadership is the product, not the cause, of these structural impediments. Both inside the country and in exile, these conditions have created a new momentum that is emerging today. This momentum is based on the need, one, for reconciliation and unity between Gaza and the West Bank, between Fatah and Hamas, as a condition to resolve the issue of representation, either through elections or through a coalition government. Second, the futility of continued dependence on American mediation of the conflict, referred to by Mustafa Barghouti, and the need to pursue their case within an international context that includes formal UN institutions, as well as seeking strategic alliances with key European states such as Spain, Belgium, and France. Another axis is a strategy of confrontation with the settlements and settlers, the building of the wall, and a sustained struggle against the land grab policy of the Israeli government. These are struggles that are taking place on a daily basis in Bil'in, in Qalandia, in Budros, in Sheikh Jarrah, in Nabi Saleh, and several other nodes of defiance. Sometimes we hear about them, mostly we do not. They belong to a movement that has been non-violent, focused, and sustained. Its success, despite the campaign of vilification against the ISM and other international and Jewish participants in it, have been largely due to its non-violent tactics. It effectively contains community activists, villagers, and international supporters. It brought international attention to the predicament of the Palestinians under occupation and highlighted the centrality of the land question in this struggle. It should be compared to the futile and counterproductive use of unguided rockets in Gaza against Israeli targets. A significant dimension in this campaign is the international campaign of boycott and divestment, which highlights the colonial nature of the Israeli regime and replicate the precedents of the apartheid system in South Africa. So far, this campaign has had limited but important successes, partly because of the ability of Israel and its allies to muster much more powerful a machinery of opposition than was the case with the apartheid South African regime. Finally, Palestinians realize that their protagonists are powerful and the machine of occupation is formidable but not invincible. Their political objectives require a policy of protracted struggle in which survival, resilience, and the building of local institutions of sustenance are crucial. In many ways, this period records the conditions which sustained the first Intifada, both in tactics and objectives, despite the changed circumstances. The problem today is that these three struggles are undertaken by different segments of political currents and often falsely portrayed as exclusive of each other. For example, there is a tendency to portray the international campaign for UN recognition in terms of an outdated negotiation strategy, and that the boycott campaign is predicated on seeking the creation of a single electoral solution for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Either you negotiate or you fight, has been a recent slogan. Either you struggle for a single all-encompassing state in Palestine, or you succumb to a mini-state equivalent to Bantustan status. These are false alternatives, partly because they are not political options that the Palestinians can choose from. If the struggle for statehood within the 1967 borders is becoming increasingly elusive because of the manner in which the Israeli expropriation of land and building of settlements have eroded territorial contiguity in a future Palestinian entity, and because it undermines the possibility of real sovereignty, then the struggle for a single state in historical Palestine is doubly elusive because it is predicated on the liquidation of the Israeli state and the creation of a supranational entity. We should ultimately learn to combine modes of struggle that are realizable and have international legitimacy. These twin considerations are pivotal and necessary for the long struggle ahead. Thank you.
Allow me first to start by thanking the Palestine Center for having me here today, and I'm especially honored to be sharing a panel with Dr. Salim Tamari and Dr. Mustafa Barghouti, especially in light of the question that's being posed to us today. So which way forward? It's such a complex question. There's so many developments taking place on a daily basis that one is overwhelmed by the prospect of analyzing their impact on Palestine. And as we know, everything impacts on Palestine. From the Arab revolutions, to the Occupy actions around the world, to the Palestinian bid for UN membership, to the recent attacks on Gaza and the 2 boats currently sailing that was just stopped this morning by the Israelis. Twitter. To the Palestinian membership in UNESCO and the US response and the Israeli response, one feels as if we, Palestinians, are collectively on a roller coaster ride, truly unsure of where we will be once it stops. And one of the major reasons why it's been so difficult to figure out which way forward is because for too long we have been responding, reacting to developments taking place and adopting a wait-and-see attitude that has greatly debilitated our struggle. Allow me to provide a brief analysis, and that from the perspective of an activist, as to what has happened to the Palestinian national struggle and why I believe that the current boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which was addressed briefly by both Dr. Salim Tamari and Dr. Mustafa Barghouti, is an essential component that must be adopted and upheld by all Palestinians and solidarity workers in order to get us back on track for independence and self-determination. Oslo was an amazing success for the Israeli Zionist colonial project. It enabled the fragmentation of the Palestinian struggle. Prior to the Oslo Accords, the Palestinian struggle had, or at the very least presented, a unified vision that was articulated in one demand: a democratic, secular state in all of historic Palestine. This vision encompassed the 3 segments of Palestinian society: Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians living under occupation, and the vast majority of Palestinians who were refugees. Every Palestinian upheld this vision, and it was proclaimed in every facet of our struggle. However, after the signing of the Oslo Accords and the onset of the peace process, our vision as a people, and as a result our movement for independence, became quite ambiguous. The Palestinian struggle was characterized by a myriad of tactical and, more importantly, strategic differences that created internal discord, infighting, and as a result, major splits among international solidarity workers. Campaigns were launched with little unifying thread. National symbols lost their meanings. No one agreed any longer what the flag represented and what Palestine we were referring to when we chanted "Free, Free Palestine." The Palestinian leadership was also called into question. We went from the vast majority of Palestinians endorsing the PLO as our sole legitimate representative to having the PLO relegated to the back seat while the Palestinian Authority was now negotiating on our behalf. And for different groups and individuals within Palestine and within the international solidarity movement, the symbols and words of the movements reflected directly opposing visions. The focus of the movement shifted from collectively targeting Israel as the colonizer and oppressor to targeting each other in a useless debate regarding the one-state or two-state solution. The struggle was split between those maintaining the need to uphold justice, equality, and rights, but with no concrete strategy as to how to achieve these goals, to those with a set strategy, negotiations, with a seeming abandonment, or according to some claims, a postponement of the historical vision of the struggle in the name of pragmatism. And because our discussion and our struggle became an intra-Palestinian one, we were no longer able to effectively respond to the colonial project that continued in its path, confiscating greater tracts of land, displacing more Palestinians, and continuing its slow ethnic cleansing of the indigenous people of Palestine. At the outbreak of the quote-unquote Second Intifada in Palestine and as activists, we were in limbo. How could we respond to the devastating impact of the increasingly brutal occupation and colonization on Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza Strip? Freedom of movement, confiscation of land through settlements, the construction of the wall, the checkpoints, water issues, political prisoners, violations against education, healthcare, and not to mention the day-to-day bombardment and killing and injuring and closures and curfews that were practically crippling us. And it quickly became apparent for many of us that it was not only impossible to respond to all of these issues, but totally ineffective. These various injustices reflected the symptoms of the occupation, and what we needed to address was the root cause of the conflict, the colonial nature of the State of Israel, and its impact on all of the indigenous people of Palestine. Many of us felt a renewed sense of urgency for the need to develop an effective national strategy for liberation that would mobilize international solidarity movements into action. And so we called for boycott. Boycott has historically been a tool of the Palestinian struggle. From the Great Revolt of 1936 to the First Intifada, Palestinians have been carrying out general and commercial strikes and boycotting colonial products to protest first British rule, then Zionist aggression, and ultimately Israeli occupation and colonization. However, the current Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, BDS, dates back to 2001. In Durban, South Africa, despite Western governments' unwillingness to hold Israel accountable for its violations against Palestinian human rights, the non-governmental forum of the UN World Conference Against Racism widely adopted a resolution stating that Israel's special form of apartheid must be met with the same tools that brought down its South African predecessor. And a number of Palestinian NGOs participated in this conference, and the proverbial light went on. In the following years, a number of BDS initiatives were launched in the UK, France, Belgium, Australia, Canada, and South Africa. Even in the United States, we had several divestment campaigns in Berkeley, Harvard, MIT, Columbia, Michigan, and elsewhere. And at Birzeit University, where we were struggling to do the bulldozing of the main road between the university and Ramallah, massive financial problems, denial of visas to faculty, the inability of faculty and students to access the university, and the detention and arrest of a number of our students, we launched the Right to Education campaign. And in May 2002, faculty and staff at Birzeit issued a statement which acknowledged the boycott and divestment initiatives taking place in Europe and the US, and, quote, appealed to the international academic community to suspend ties with Israeli academic institutions, boycott academic conferences held in Israel, and urge their institutions to withdraw any investments they have in Israeli companies and corporations. So working closely with the international boycott and divestment initiatives taking place, Palestinian academics, intellectuals, activists, cultural workers came together, and in 2004 we launched the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel. 1 year later, the BDS strategy was clearly articulated in the Palestinian Civil Society Call of July 9, 2005. And the call became the basis for BDS organization around the world, which eventually was coordinated by the Palestinian BDS National Committee, or the BNC, note the acronym, established in 2007. In the past 6.5 years, the BDS movement has become one of the most powerful tools for international solidarity, I would argue, that has ever been created by the Palestinian struggle. One need only to visit the official website of the BNC to see the various successes of the movement. For example, Cambridge University students vote to break contact with Veolia. Turkish company cancels order worth NIS 100,000 from Carmel Carpets. Alstom, which Dr. Mustafa Barghouti mentioned, loses Saudi Haramain railway contract worth 10 billion. Tunisian athlete refuses to play against Israelis. Paris law court's ruling supports the rights of citizens and consumers to call for a boycott of Israel and its products. Globe's report, settlement produce company Grexco, a key target of the BDS movement, is set for liquidation. The Mission Responsibility through Investment Committee of the Presbyterian Church recommends divestment from 3 companies. And this is just in the past 2 months. One can see that the boycott movement has reached all corners of the world. from Africa to Europe, Australia to Asia, North and South America, and what is often considered one of the most challenging areas, the Arab world, where governments have long provided lip service to the Palestinian movement while developing economic and political relations with Israel. This hypocrisy is sure to continue to be challenged as a result of the changes that are now taking place in the Arab world. One can also see the range of organizations and diversity of initiatives. Unions, faith-based organizations, academic institutions, civil society organizations, and increasingly government structures around the world conducting BDS actions in the economic, academic, cultural, and athletic realms. So the question that presents itself is, why has BDS been able to capture the hearts and minds of a growing Palestinian solidarity movement? Why now? And I believe 4 major factors have converged to not only galvanize widespread condemnation of Israel, but mobilize people around the world to action in the form of BDS. The first is something that Dr. Salim Tamari and Dr. Mustafa Barghouti asked for, which is a unified and unifying Palestinian vision, strongly rooted in international law with a rights-based approach. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. The second component or factor is the connection of the BDS movement with the Palestinian nonviolent resistance on the ground that, again, was mentioned by both previous speakers. In addition to its connection with anti-Zionist movement within Israel that has been essential for the development of the movement, and its connection to the international social justice movements like the Occupy Wall Street, but more specifically the historic boycott movements of South Africa and the civil rights movement here in the United States. The third factor is the increasingly evident criminality of the nature of the Israeli colonial system as witnessed in the brutal attacks at the start of the Second Intifada, the bombing of Lebanon and Gaza in 2006, the attack on Gaza of 2008-2009, and the attack on the Freedom Flotilla in 2010. This was coupled with a growing awareness of the impunity Israel was afforded by the international community after each one of these brutal attacks. And the fourth factor was the effective use of electronic information and social media. One need only look at this conference and see how that's useful in terms of exposing Israeli criminality and its impunity in the face of that criminality, disseminating calls and facilitating a very dynamic exchange between the Palestinian BDS leadership and activists around the world to provide a platform for an exchange of information, resources, and actions within the movement. So let me just briefly look at the first factor that I identified. In terms of a unified and unifying Palestinian vision, which directly also relates back to my discussion about the Oslo process and what it did to the Palestinian national struggle, we can see this vision clearly articulated in the 3 demands of the BDS call. Its demands are: 1, an end to the occupation and colonization of all Arab lands; 2, a recognition of the fundamental rights of the Arabs, Palestinian citizens of Israel, to full equality; and 3, the implementation of the Palestinian refugees' right of return. By specifically addressing each of the sector of Palestinian society, the call ensured a widespread support among all Palestinians and not just those living in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. It further sent a clear message to the Palestinian Authority, to Israel, to the US, and to the international community that nothing less than the achievement of all of the rights of the indigenous people of Palestine will bring about a just peace. 170 Palestinian civil society organizations, including the Council of National and Islamic Forces in Palestine, which is the coordinating body for all the major political parties, including Hamas and Fatah, signed on to this call. Unions, non-governmental organizations, which represented the political, social, economic, and geographic spectrum of Palestinians, those that were living under occupation, living inside Israel, and refugees living around the world, signed on to this call. And while unifying the struggle and focusing it on a specific tactic, that of BDS, the call also allowed for flexible, creative, and context-based BDS initiatives, acknowledging that people around the world would need to develop campaigns that reflected different levels of political will and political context. This aspect enabled organizations that were focused solely on occupation to carry out BDS initiatives against elements associated with the occupation, i.e. settlement products, companies within settlements, universities in settlements, builders of settlements, and so on, so long as these initiatives did not undermine the principles of the Palestinian call. The flexibility of the call and its proven effectiveness even allowed the Palestinian Authority to join the BDS movement by organizing their own campaign, the Al-Karama campaign in 2010, targeting Israeli settlement products. The second factor I'd like to briefly address was that the BDS movement complemented the nonviolent resistance taking place on the ground and allowed for a connection between Palestinian activists on the ground, Israeli anti-Zionist activists, and international solidarity movements. Further, the movement's strong identification with the South African anti-apartheid movement, and this is why I told you to note the acronym BNC, which is one element, and we can talk about other parallels between the Palestinian BDS movement and the anti-apartheid, South African anti-apartheid movement. It provided a model that inspired hope as well as a framework that enabled activism. The fact that the South Africans, and specifically anti-apartheid activists, embraced those parallels between apartheid South Africa and Israel was crucial to the development of the movement. Now, in conclusion, I have to say that all this is not to say there aren't serious challenges to this movement. From legal actions to personal attacks, BDS activists in Palestine, in Israel, and increasingly in the US are being targeted. And even recently, a lawsuit against the BDS activists in Lebanon was issued. But perhaps the biggest challenge to the BDS movement comes from within. Palestinians continue to live within a contradictory political spectrum. On the one hand, believing in our fundamental, inalienable right to self-determination and return, and on the other hand, trying desperately to play a political game with little political power that at best would provide us with truncated rights for less than 1/3 of our people. The contradictions inherent in our current political reality were manifested recently in Mahmoud Abbas's speech to the UN applying for Palestinian statehood. And here I refer you to Sari Maqdisi's speech that he gave last month right here at the Jerusalem Fund, where he spoke much more eloquently about those contradictions than I could. But in short, Abbas attempted to invoke the history of Nakba and international law as it pertains to the right of return, but then proceeded to make demands based upon a peace process that has totally ignored the historic right and the plight of the Palestinians. So right now, we as Palestinians have a golden opportunity. Through nonviolent resistance on the ground, a strong Palestinian narrative that is being increasingly eloquently told through various media, impeccable documentation and research on Israel's violations, and our ability to move thousands of organizations, both governmental and non-governmental, to action in the form of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. The only thing now standing in our way is ourselves. The time has come for us to embrace this amazing tool of BDS and uphold the morally conscientious principles and objectives of the call, and support the ever-growing international solidarity movement that is working so hard to support us. Thank you.
I was pleased to hear Ms. Barghouti refer to the Presbyterian initiative recently and to faith-based initiatives in general, or faith-based communities, because I feel that this is an element that is becoming much more important and that has not been given enough attention to. And for example, when visitors come here from the occupied territories and so on, I wonder whether they're sufficiently attentive to meetings in churches and outreach of this kind of work, and what is the thinking and the strategy for capitalizing on this growing element of the struggle.
My question is for Riham Barghouti. The illustrations you gave from the BDS movement of the past 2 months focused on boycott and divestment. I wanted to ask your vision for the S in BDS. Thank you.
This is primarily directed for Dr. Tamari, but anyone on the panel can answer this. But you addressed the Abbas's proposal or suggestion of dismantling the PA and returning power back to the Israeli occupation to put on display the colonial nature of the occupation. But what would be then the hope for outcome if the Palestinian Authority is dismantled?
Dr. Barghouti, I missed your fourth point about how the PA should change its economic policy. Does that mean to get rid of all of Fayyad's type of activities?
All right, so the first is in regards to faith-based organizations, and I don't think that people realize, we talk a lot about what happened in 2002 in terms of divestment initiatives and boycott initiatives that were made from academic institutions, but really the third major group was churches. So from the United Methodist Church to the Presbyterian Church to the Church of England, a number of these churches started to talk about the issue of needing to divest. And we were briefly talking about this previously with somebody else from the Presbyterian Church, is that we don't realize how slowly it takes for churches to move in any particular direction, but there was definitely from the beginning, between PACB, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic, Cultural, and Boycott of Israel, and the BNC, a lot of discussion and statements of appreciation to all of these initial initiatives that took place. I think that one of the organizations that's focused mostly on this is Sabir, which is a faith-based organization in the occupied territories, and has been carrying out a lot of work around socially responsible investment and trying to move the churches forward. But I agree with you that further work needs to be carried out, because the potential for that, the impact of that, and we will wait to see what happens with the Presbyterian Church, is huge.
It has to be discussed more.
Definitely. And also bringing back the fact, and this is an essential component that people tend to forget, that we have Palestinian Christians, and this kind of component, that this is not just a Muslim-Jewish situation. It is an issue where you have Palestinians, Muslims, Christians, and even on some places Jews that consider themselves Palestinians, and this Israeli colonial project. This is the two assets of this struggle. Now, in terms of sanctions, right? So, like I said, the BDS movement has long upheld its, or draws inspiration from and guidance from the anti-apartheid movement against South Africa. And if we look at that, it took over 2 decades of vast initiatives in boycott and divestment that were mainly carried out by civil society organizations before some governments began to carry out sanctions. Now, a lot of our South African partners tell us that our struggle is actually moving much faster, because we have already had, for example, the Norwegian Pension Fund that divested from Elbit Systems and Africa Israel in 2010 was one example of government-based action against, upholding the BDS movement. Now there are increasingly calls, for end of U.S. aid to Israel. But we have to understand that this is going to happen right before the end, right? Right before Israel crumbles, right before it becomes no longer viable to stay a colonizing entity. The U.S. is going to give us support, which is the same thing that happened with, South Africa in regards to the UK and to the U.S. So it is a situation where, for example, now the Saudis, taking this $10 billion contract from Alstom is another indicator. There is movement, but it comes after massive civil society starts to act and present this as an effective strategy, and then we get governments, because governments are going to be always the last to change. We have to change them, and that's what's the power of the BDS movement, is it puts it back in our hands, not waiting for a decision from an outside body that we have very little control over.
The question was, what happens after the call for dismantling the Palestinian Authority? It's an interesting question, because it used to be raised by a number of dissident groups and oppositional figures. And most recently, figures from Fatah Revolutionary Council have added their weight to this. And even Mahmoud Abbas himself, I'm not sure if seriously or in jest, expressed a desire to join these groups. The idea behind it actually is that Because of the paralysis in the negotiating process and the inability of the Palestinian Authority to engender any kind of Israeli withdrawal or even implementation of the terms of the Oslo Accords, it will dissolve itself and turn it over to a UN trusteeship. So it have a semi-colonial status, and similar to that of Mozambique or even the colonies under the League of Nations, between the two worlds. So then Israel will be facing not the Palestinians, but the international body and a military contingent within that international body, and its occupation and transitional to independence. This would be the most positive scenario of this. But I think, as I hinted, there is another possibility, is that Israel will not take over the territories in the pre-93-94 period. It will hand it over either to municipal councils or to a number of Israeli implicit collaborators who would say, we are here to save the situation because the Palestinians will be left unprotected, there's danger of Somalization, we have to move in. And they will give it an ideological cover. So it's really a very contentious and problematic proposal, but one that is being considered seriously now among Palestinians.
Yes, I will respond to this question, but I'd like also to make a comment about another question relating to the dismantlement of the Palestinian Authority. On the issue of economic policy, you probably know, and there has been a lot of writing from the Israeli side about their proposition of economic peace as a substitute to real peace. This has been Lieberman's policy, Netanyahu's policy, and their main goal is to transform the whole idea of Palestinian statehood into clusters of Bantustans and ghettos with some economic improvement, mainly coming from foreign aid. And that's why, by the way, this year and last year, the level of aid that is coming to the Palestinian Authority is unprecedented. If you exclude Israel, it's the highest in the world at the rate of almost $860 per capita, and 92% of it goes to the Palestinian Authority. So the goal has been to create false, what I call a bubble of economic development that is truly false, because it's not based on development of real economy, but rather the creation of a consumption style beyond people's ability, and that is very much based on an unprecedented level of debt and loans that people take from the banks at a rate of 30 times the amount of their salary, which is something that doesn't happen anywhere in the world except here. So in my opinion, this policy has to be changed completely, because it is creating very serious weakness within the Palestinian society. It is creating a lot of dependence on foreign aid and on debt, and it makes people vulnerable to external pressure and to Israeli pressure. A very good example of that is what Israel is doing today when they announced that they're going to withhold our tax revenue, which represents about 70% of the authority income locally. And if the people who get their salaries cannot get their salaries, that means they would lose their homes, they could lose their cars, they could lose their privileges, because they are connected with loan system with the banks. So that is a policy that weakens the society, weakens our ability to resist Israeli pressures. And that's why this whole policy has to change. An approach of economic liberalism in a country that is under Israeli occupation simply makes no sense. And that's why there is an over expenditure from the budget on things like security. An amount of 34% of the total Palestinian budget goes to security, while insufficient amount goes to social welfare and to supporting health and educational system, in my opinion. That's why this whole economic policy needs to change. But most important, the areas that are affected by Israel, like Jerusalem, like the old town of Hebron, like the areas that are affected by the wall, do not receive the sufficient support that they should receive so that they can stand up to the pressures against them that is trying to force them to leave. One very important phenomenon that I would like, I hope that researchers will try to study it more, is the fact that the Palestinian Authority is limited and its projects are limited, including the projects that are coming from, that are supported from outside. It is limited to the so-called Area A and B, which represents maybe no more than 35% of the West Bank, while Area C is an area that is under Israel's full control, and they don't allow any serious projects to take place. And there is constant pressure on the population that live in Area C to leave and go to Area A and B. In that sense, this economic policy, combined in combination with the settlement expansion and military Israeli measures on the ground, are all components of one policy which is trying to squeeze the Palestinian statehood into nothing but a small area called Area A and B in less than 40% of the West Bank. And thus, it represents an Israeli effort to destroy the whole concept of real Palestinian statehood and transform it into structures of Bantustans and ghettos. That's why this economic policy needs to change. And this whole notion about great prosperity that is happening and this huge bubble that is taking place in Ramallah does not really represent the reality on the ground at all. I want to comment on the issue of dismantling the PA. That is an issue that has to be tackled in a very clear and careful way. First of all, I think when somebody comes up and says, let the Israelis come and take over our health and educational system, I think this is irresponsible. I guess those who say these things are those who did not witness how we struggled hard for a period of 35 years to establish an alternative health system to the system that was controlled by occupation, or an alternative educational system in the form of our universities and other structures, despite Israeli pressures. So if we want to speak about dismantling the authority, the first thing that should be mentioned here is there should be complete and immediate stop of security collaboration with Israel. This would be a serious matter. If somebody really means business and wants to threaten the Israelis, the first thing that should be stopped immediately is security cooperation with Israel. This would frighten them completely. This would alert them, and this will be serious. Another thing that Israel now is threatening is to take away from many people responsible in the Palestinian Authority their privileges in the form of the so-called VIP status. I have called long time ago on all people to give up these privileges and throw it away, and throw away the VIP cards, because it makes no sense for any Palestinian, especially those who are in positions of leadership or important authority positions. It makes no sense for them to take privileges from the occupation and be treated different from the people they should be representing. So, in my opinion, we can challenge the Israelis. Maybe there will come a point in a confrontation where the whole authority would collapse. But let them do it. Cut the security cooperation with them. Remove away the privileges. Let the people see that we are all unified in our interaction with the Israeli side, and that we are all similar, and that there are no privileges to anybody. And let the Israelis understand that no more the Palestinian Authority will carry the responsibility of security for them. And let us make it clear to everybody in the world that it is totally unacceptable to have a situation where people who are under occupation are supposed to provide security to their occupiers without being able even to provide security and protection to their own people from the same occupiers. This is a serious matter. This can be serious. This is a suggestion that can make a big difference. But that is different from saying, come and take over our educational system or our health system. One last point, if I may add, about boycott, divestment, sanctions. And of course that relates to the boycott campaign we are trying now to run in the occupied territories. It is very important to always think about how to be effective. And it is very important to measure the effectiveness of what we do. And in that sense, I think in parallel to activities that are taking place now in the United States in terms of encouraging people to boycott Israeli products or impose sanctions on Israel, it is very important, in my opinion, for those who are in support of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian community itself to create links with the progressive groups in the American society, whether we are talking about churches, about the African American community, about Hispanic groups, women progressive groups. It is very important that these groups in the United States understand that being in solidarity with Palestine is an act of humanity, and that the Palestinian issue is not a Muslim issue or Christian issue or an Arab issue. It is a human issue, and that the Palestinian struggle today resembles the same struggle that people had in South Africa against apartheid system, and resembles the African American struggle at one point for equality. That is an aspect that requires a lot of work and a lot of activity, but effectiveness is very important. That's why we've just started a new campaign where we are picking up one product. Now we've picked up the Tapozina product, the juices that Israel sells in the occupied territories, and we're going to destroy their presence in the Palestinian market. After that, we'll take a second product and a third product in a very strategic way. And not only that, I would support what Riham said moments ago, that we should engage also the Palestinians who live inside Israel in 48 areas in the same struggle. So at one point, I think we will go and call on our Palestinian people inside Israel to also participate in this boycott campaign. This way we can be effective. We should be specific, effective, be able to measure what we do, and continue the struggle. As I said, I am optimistic, and I think if we are strategic enough, we can achieve a lot of results. Thank you.
What are the financial sustainability projections and timetables for BDS to succeed?
Mike Harrison with the United Methodist Church office. What about in the anti-apartheid struggle, which I was very much a part of? The UN used to have conferences, International Solidarity Conference. What about a UN International Solidarity Conference on in solidarity with Palestine? Should that be part of the strategy? Very quickly, should we also have a strategy to replace U.S. money that they want to pull out of UN agencies? And what countries we should go after to replace that funds? And lastly, there's a need, at least from I hear from other Palestinian friends, the Arab in Africa, everywhere African governments went, they always talked about ending apartheid. What I hear from Palestinians, everywhere Arab governments go, they don't talk enough about ending Palestinian repression.
Hi there, my name is Jesse Rosenfeld. I was a journalist based in Palestine for the past while. My question is for Dr. Tamari. You spoke a lot about the impacts of the Arab Spring on the March 15th movement and internal movements to end division, but can you talk a little bit about its impact on the Palestinian refugee movement and its repoliticization, especially in light of what happened in May and June on the borders?
Hi, my question is for Dr. Barghouti and the other panelists as well. Given that Palestinian rights are in fundamental conflict with the Zionist enterprise, and that the realization of these rights would nullify Israel's self-imagined reason for being, I'm wondering why there's such reticence for BDS and Palestinian solidarity activists to clearly and unequivocally articulate a vision for the dismantling of the Zionist regime and the formation of one state.
This gets to dismantling the PA. We're doing a campaign to try and fund UNESCO for the missing funds, but the US legislation has written that it's if the PLO is recognized. So I wondered if any of your participants had a way to work around that, as this is not really the PLO anymore, it's the PA or maybe even the state of Palestine.
Thank you.
I think that I'm just mainly going to address the two questions specifically around BDS and leave the others for my co-panelists. In terms of the feasibility of the movement and any kind of timetable, I think, like I said previously, all of us in the movement are really surprised by how quickly this movement is progressing. And I think for the various reasons that I mentioned before, but the fact that it's framework is put within the framework of international law and human rights, it has become something that a lot of different people can respond to. So the movement really doesn't need, I mean, it's one of those things that doesn't really need a lot of money. The counter campaign against BDS is, you know, Israelis are spending billions, but we don't need that much money. Most people that have come onto the BDS campaign are organizations that already existed. They are civil society organizations. They have their platforms, they've been working, and increasingly we are getting more mainstream organizations. So for example, an organization like Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a huge organization with a lot of support and you know, a national organization here in the US, recently, not recently, actually a year ago or so, launched their We Divest, calling on TIAA-CREF, which is a US pension giant, to withdraw its funds from companies that are profiting from the Israeli occupation. And they have resources. Most organizations that are coming on, Code Pink, Sahaba campaign, you know, has their own resources. So it's feasible for this movement to go on because, like I said, it's based off of civil society organizations, unions, churches, civil, you know, non-governmental organizations, and it doesn't need a lot of funds in order for it to progress. And surprisingly enough, once you start working on BDS, which would happen to Adala New York, you start getting silent supporters, people that cannot vocally do the work that you're doing, but really want to support you financially. And I'm not going to even try to set up a timetable for, you know, when we're going to the next level. But I think that as we become more mainstream, as the BDS movement becomes more mainstream, it's going to grow exponentially. We're going to see, you know, leaps and bounds because it's taken us a lot of work to get to the point that we've gotten to now. And this goes back to the second question, which is regards to why doesn't the BDS movement adopt the one-state solution and start promoting that. And like I said in my talk, many organizations that signed on to the BDS movement are not necessarily all supporting a one-state solution. Some support a two-state solution, some support a one-state solution. But everybody in the BDS movement supports the three rights that are the Palestinian BDS movement supports the three rights that are being upheld by the movement. So we did not want to enter into this debate of an issue of a one-state or a two-state. What we want to advance is basic Palestinian human rights. Taking that to its ultimate level, once you have an end of occupation and colonization of all Arab lands, which includes the Syrian Golan Heights, once you have equality for Palestinian citizens living inside Israel, one person, one vote, and once you have the Palestinian right of return implemented, you cannot continue to have you know, an ethnic nation based for, you know, giving privileges and rights to one religious group over another. At that time, if it continues to be called Israel, if we create another state alongside it, if on both states people have equal rights, or if a one-state solution happens, it really doesn't matter. The end political point is an issue that has been brought up by the Oslo Accords and has been brought up and sidelined the focus of this movement, which should be, you know, advancing rights of Palestinians.
Very quickly, the impact of the March 15th movement on the question of refugees. The main feature of this has been the issue of movement of people from Gaza outside the blockade of the Gaza Strip. And remember that Gaza, 70% of the population of Gaza are refugees, and there the question of civil rights and refugeehood are mixed together in a very meaningful way. The most likely scenario now is that no Egyptian government that will come will maintain the Mubarak blockade on Gaza. It's inconceivable. However, that does not mean that Egypt will open up the borders. Egypt probably renegotiate the terms of the Camp David Accord with Israel. It's unlikely that they will abolish it. They have already renegotiated the issue of the gas prices with Israel. The Egyptians are worried that totally open borders would lead to irredentist, some fundamentalist groups will penetrate into Sinai from there to Egypt. So they have a security concern about opening Gaza. However, it's unlikely that they will maintain the blockade, and this will be a major achievement of the protest movement as well as the of the Egyptian revolution of January 2011.
I don't want to repeat what Riham said, but she's right. We don't need another division in the Palestinian community and in the Palestinian struggle between those who want two states and those who want one state, because all of us want freedom for Palestinians. All of us want to end the apartheid system. So I think we should concentrate on what unifies us. At the same time, we should not give Israel this time the chance to claim that the Palestinians were the ones who gave up the two-state solution, and that the Palestinians were, because the moment we say we are giving up the two-state option, they will start saying, yes, Palestinians never really wanted a Palestinian state, all they want is to destroy Israel and so on. We have to make it clear this time that Israel was the one who destroyed the two-states option. We have to make it clear to everybody that this time Israel is the one that was responsible for destroying that very last chance. And meanwhile, we have to be clear. As Palestinians, we should not accept any state. We should not accept any arrangement. There is a very dangerous approach, and there are some people sometimes, some Palestinians unfortunately, who might be ready to accept a Minnie Mouse state with ghettos and pantostans just for the sake of having the name and what resembles an authority. That should not be acceptable, and that's why clear position about the borders, clear position about the issue of refugees, the clear position about Jerusalem is very important. And meanwhile, we have to be ready that if the two-states option is killed, and it is being killed with the passage of every minute and with the creation of every new settlement block, then we have to be ready to demand a one-state solution and full democratic rights for Palestinians, which is not new, by the way. This is originally the Palestinian movement demand. But again, tactics are important as much as strategy is important. Tactics are also important here. It's very important that we keep ourselves unified, and it's very important that we hold Israel responsible for the failure of two-state solution. Thank you.